Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing SHEIKH JARRAH and what's been happening in that neighborhood in Jerusalem. We know that that has been the site of a huge court battle over an initial decision by Israel to want to evict the Palestinian residents of that neighborhood, claiming that the land, in fact, that they're living on is Israel's. And in fact, even an Israeli settlement company has sort of bought that land already, so to speak, and now wants to then build settlements on that very land and to remove the Palestinian residents that are currently living there. Now, this court battle has continued. It has become fairly internationalized, especially considering recent events that occurred surrounding SHEIKH JARRAH and the publicity that it got. We've even had certain Democrats in the United States bringing attention to this, Democrat lawmakers, that is, and even celebrities and others. So this has brought a lot of pressure on Israel, which continues to claim that its judiciary is completely independent and it cannot control what its judiciary does. So its judiciary then has passed or has asked for an understanding to then be reached between the residents, the Palestinian residents that is, and the Israeli settlers, saying that in a way the Palestinian residents in fact need to pay rent to the settlers. And obviously for the Palestinians that is unacceptable, because that would mean they are accepting that these homes are not theirs, that they've been living in for generations, really. And for the Israelis on the other side, their argument is that they cannot accept that either at this time. So that agreement, or that the compromise that the court had hoped would be reached, has already arrived dead in this case. Let's discuss this a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Mark Ayyash, who is an associate professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He is joining us this morning from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Joining us from Fahem is Husni Abu Hussein, who is an advocate for the SHEIKH JARRAH neighborhood as well as the families that live there. Husni Abu Hussein and Mark, thank you both for your time today. Husni Abu Hussein, I'd like to start with you. Could you just tell us what the families feel about what the court has said?
There are four eviction orders that were given by the first court at the Central Court, the second one in Jerusalem, and after that we appealed to the Supreme Court in Israel to abolish all these orders. For the first time, we brought from Jordan and from Turkey many documents that says that the ownership of this parcels of land did not belong to the settler. For the first time now, the High Court of Jerusalem we asked the High Court or the Supreme Court to look all these documents and to abolish the eviction order that was given before 1 year. And on Monday, and the last Monday, at the 2nd of August 2021, after the Supreme Court panel of 3 justices they hear our argument. They give us some compromise, and we compromise that all the eviction order, the proposal of the justice is to abolish all the eviction orders, and they will give all the Palestinians families a status of protected tenants.
Yeah.
And so that, but the Jewish company asked us to agree that the ownership of the parcels belonged to the settlers company, right. And we rejected that. For that, the proposal that was given to us, we will discuss it with the families tomorrow, okay. And after that we will inform the Supreme Court.
Okay, Mark, let me bring you into this. You just heard there somebody who's directly involved with this case speaking about it. What are your thoughts about this compromise that the court wants both sides to reach?
Very much for having me. This is not a compromise. This is an attempt to assert Israeli will and to cement Israeli settler colonial power over the Palestinians. There is no compromise here whatsoever. The Israeli court system is part and parcel of the Israeli settler colonial project, which is to take land from the Palestinian and make it Israeli Jewish. And so there has been throughout history some limited success for Palestinians who have taken their cases to Israeli courts, but those are a drop in the bucket. The overwhelming trend is for Israeli courts to uphold Israeli settler colonial domination over the land of historic Palestine. And they often do it under the guise of the language of compromise and well, this is a political, they'll use the language of this is a political decision that has to be made through the negotiations, and it's not in the court's jurisdiction to rule over this. So they always pretty much either sidestep the issue, and which enables then the continuation of Palestinian dispossession, or they explicitly rule in favor of dispossessing Palestinians. So at the end of the day, justice cannot arrive for Palestinians through Israeli settler colonial courts, and I certainly would dispute the language of that this is somehow a compromise. I mean, ultimately, what the court is saying is, as long as this remains, or as long as it is acknowledged or recognized by the Palestinians that this is Jewish land and Jewish property, then you can't stay here. And that's unacceptable for the Palestinians.
Okay, let me add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined also by Mr. Hesham Kadoumi, who is a senior advisor for the Wall and Colonization Resistance Commission. He is joining us today from Ramallah. Hesham, thank you for your time. Hesham, what are your thoughts about this case, where it stands right now, and what you may think may happen next? Because as Mark there also mentioned, essentially the Israelis do want this to go forward in a way where everyone acknowledges that this is their land.
Thank you, Waqar, and I would like to greet your guests. And I'm sorry, I think I'm encountering some technical problems. I could not hear clearly what have been said, but in general, I understood your question. First of all, Waqar, let me ensure one fact that, first of all, before debating what's going on and what is the opinion of what's so-called the Israeli Supreme Court, let us assure several facts. First of all, this issue, the issue of Sheikh Jarrah and other neighborhoods in Jerusalem, including Silwan, Batn al-Hawa, and many other areas in East Jerusalem, is a pure political issue. It is not a judicial issue. That's number one fact. Number two fact is that what's happening now in Sheikh Jarrah is a continuation of a colonial project that aims at evicting Palestinians mainly from East Jerusalem city and to continue Judizing the entire city for the favor of Israeli colonists, and also to include the vicinity of Jerusalem area, especially in the eastern slopes, to evacuate the whole area from the Palestinian presence. So referring back to the core issue, this is a highly political issue. It is not a judicial issue because, first of all, what's going on now in the Supreme Court is like, it can't happen in under any justice system. Imagine that the Supreme Court is refusing to even examine the documents that have been submitted by the Palestinian owners, and now they are trying to maneuver the situation by something called a compromise, which is not a compromise, in fact, simply because neither the court nor the Israeli political level can find any legal basis for transferring this ownership to the Jewish or for the Israeli colonists, because the history of the area is very well known, and the owners of the houses in Sheikh Jarrah have all the legal documents that prove that they are the owners of the of their
Okay,
houses.
so if I could just come in, I wanted to bring in Husni Abu Hussein back in. Husni, I wanted to ask you, both of our other guests have mentioned that this is not an issue, a judicial issue, but this is in fact a political issue. That this is something beyond just a legal issue, that Israel at least keeps saying that this is a legal issue, that it cannot comment on this because its judiciary is independent. Do you agree with that?
No, I agree that this issue is a political one, and everything is between Israel and the Palestinians is a political issue. But now we want to prevent the eviction of the families. We have no alternative but to go to the High Court, the Supreme Court, to prevent the eviction of these families. So we brought all these documents in the last month, and we put all these documents before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court now did not admit that the ownership of these parcels belong to the settler, and nor also this is not belong to the Palestinians. So now we ask the High Court to abolish all these eviction orders and to ask the Ministry of Justice to begin the settlement in these parcels and to decide who is the ownership of this land. After that, we will go to the settlement officer and ask the settlement officer to register the ownership on the names of the Palestinians. Also, the Jewish communities, the settlement company will go to the settlement officer and ask that the ownership of all this land belong to them. So the officer will have to transfer all these documents to the Central Court of Jerusalem, and after that, maybe after 5 or 6 or 10 years, the Central Court will decide who is the ownership. So we think that for us now, till now, and if we abolish the eviction order, it's a success for us. But the best success will be after the Central Court, who is a competitive court in Israel, according to the Settlement Act, will decide who is the ownership.
Okay.
We now say, so there is a fact that all the Palestinians population of Sheikh Jarrah was refugees, Palestinian refugees that come to East Jerusalem, and the Jordanian authority or the Kingdom of Jordan gave them their parcel.
Okay, I'm gonna come back to you, Mr. Husni, but I got your point there. Of course, as history shows, yes, the Jordanian king did promise this neighborhood and these homes to the Palestinians, and specifically at that time, in that context of the fact that they were refugees, this was promised to them. That is again historical fact that I would hope that no one would deny. But Mark, let me bring you back into the discussion and ask you as well about the political ramifications of this for Israel, right? So as I said in my introduction, this has also really brought this into the international spotlight, as in this entire case of Sheikh Jarrah. And even we've had people within the United States, as in Democrat lawmakers, and even the Biden administration, which has felt this pressure, right? This immense political pressure to stand up for these residents, which they normally probably wouldn't if they didn't come in the news. How much effect will that have, do you think?
Let me just very quickly, I want to clarify a point before I get to this one.
Sure.
Israel is very good at playing this game. The politicians say this is a legal issue, it's not a political one. And the court says the underlying issue we won't touch because that's really a political issue and not a legal one. And it's all done in a way to distract from the reality of what is actually happening, which is Israel's project of ethnic cleansing and the forceful expulsion of Palestinians. So I just want to advise listeners to not fall into these rhetorical games that are often played by Israeli politicians, because that is the underlying problem here. And in terms of what's happening in the United States, obviously the international attention to this issue is a direct result of the activism of Palestinians in East Jerusalem and beyond, who have made this an international issue, and the continuing efforts. So even though I expect next to nothing from Israeli courts, I do think it's important to go down this path as well and take it to Israeli courts and show the world the injustice that is operating in these courts. So at the very least, it should do that. And while I am optimistic about the shifting discourse in the United States, we've seen members of Congress who are forcefully stating the case that this is not acceptable and that American policy should change. We're still, I think, far away from seeing actual real change in American policy. I am not seeing change in policy yet. We have seen change in discourse that is relevant. I'm not trying to discount that, but that needs to at one point translate into change in policy. Otherwise, that change in discourse is going to be, largely symbolic if it's not translated into policy. So I hope to see more pressure. More pressure is needed on the United States government. More pressure is needed to be placed on the Biden administration for them to do something about this. Because this kind of compromise that the Israeli court does is precisely what I would expect the Biden administration to sort of pass as action and policy change.
And on that point, Hesham, I apologize for cutting you off, but Mark, sorry, I wanted to bring in Hesham and just give him the final word. Hesham, I wanted to ask you, in fact, on that point that Mark there was just making about pressure, right, and what the Biden administration may present this quote-unquote compromise as. There's also, in fact, news coming out that Israel has told the Biden administration to tell the Palestinian Authority to pressure these families into accepting this agreement or this compromise, whatever we want to call it. Is that likely to succeed?
I don't think so, Waqar. As your guest from London said, we don't feel that a real change in the American policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at large. But at least maybe the stances of this new U.S. administration is relatively different from what we were used during Trump administration, though we did not see a real pressure until now to stop Israel from this project. I call it a project because we are not talking about Sheikh Jarrah only. We are talking about also more than 300 Palestinian communities in Area C, which are all prone under pressure under ethnic cleansing plans. But at least what we can see that there is sort of support from regional and international arena, and you can imagine even in the court session there were some solidarity groups and EU member states representatives that have witnessed the deliberation of the court. I disagree to call it a compromise. What's the Israeli High Court is trying to do, because our history and our experience with Israel is very bad regarding their commitments to the agreement. That's number one. Number two is the interpretation of terms and agreements. And as they now say that the protected tenants for the third generation, and yet the details of these issues are not yet clear. So we don't have to go to this trick, because the main objective of the court and the Israeli political level is to obtain a recognition from the Palestinians that this is the ownership of this land belongs to the settlers. That's what they are trying to achieve right now.
Okay, so we'll have to leave it there at that, Hesham. I do apologize again for cutting you off. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We really appreciate Hesham, Mark, and Husni Abu Hussein for taking their time out of their busy schedules to speak to us. They were speaking to us respectively from Fahem, Ramallah, and Halifax in Nova Scotia. We were discussing the latest surrounding the case of the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem. As I mentioned in my introduction, this has become a flashpoint issue for the Israelis as well, internationally, especially considering all the publicity that this issue got just recently with all the events surrounding it, even before this latest court decision, not even a complete final decision really on the part of the court, calling for what at least the Israelis would call a compromise. But on the other side, as our guests they're mentioned from the Palestinian point of view, this would not be a compromise, but this would be essentially giving in, saying that this land is Israeli when the Palestinians say that it's not Israeli land, that in history Jordan promised them this land since they became refugees all the way back when Israel was formed and was made into a state. There's historical records on file, as Husni Abu Hussein there mentioned, and those are being filed and have been filed at the court. So it's not like this is all being done without evidence and without backing, but nevertheless, this is an issue which continues to divide, at least within Israel itself and Palestine, in the sense that at this point in time, there doesn't seem to be a proper agreement on the horizon, apart from, of course, the court just admitting that those historical facts, as I've mentioned and as our guests are mentioned, are in fact true, which would then mean that the Israeli settlers are then wrong. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the issue of Kashmir, but very specifically the European Union. A number of MPs, part of the European Parliament, that is, MEPs as it would be called, along with the Vice President of the European Parliament, Fabio Massimo Castaldo, have written a letter, 15 of them that is, have written a letter to Ursula von der Leyen and Joseph Borrell, who are the leaders of the European Commission itself, regarding the situation of human rights in Kashmir. And they've called for this to be highlighted and dealt with, saying that, of course, that flashpoint dispute remains a dangerous one as well for the region, but also, certainly, and most importantly, as always, we should center the Kashmiri people themselves, who continue to suffer, not just because of Article 370, but also even during the pandemic, through the many restrictions that continue to be placed upon them ever since the revocation of Article 370, but also then in the context of the pandemic and how the Indian government has specifically responded to the pandemic in that specific region. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Professor Azmat Khan, who is the former president of the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front UK. He's a senior fellow at the International Communities Organization Research Center, and he specializes in Kashmir. He is joining us today from London. Joining us this morning from Toronto is Mr. Farooq Siddiqui, who is the president of the Kashmir Global Council. He is also a consultant engineer. Mr. Farooq Siddiqui and Mr. Azmat Khan, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Mr. Siddiqui, I'd like to start with you firstly. What do you make of the importance of this letter? Because many of us would remember the trip that a number of EU MPs went on with the Indian government, essentially to overview the situation in Kashmir, and there was a lot of criticism at that time of the EU.
Yes, thank you for having me. Regarding your question, it's quite significant that the members for the first time have collectively approached the Commission. We have to understand the working of the European Parliament and European Commission. The Commission itself is the executive branch of the European Union. So earlier also, about a decade back, there was a hearing done by the Commission and about the mass graves in Kashmir. So, but definitely this is a very significant thing that a collective approach has been done by the MEPs of the European Parliament for the first time to the Commission rather than to the European Union, within the European Union itself. I would recall also that in 2005 there was a unanimous decision taken by the parliament itself regarding the human rights abuses in Indian-held Kashmir. And these are significant, and this definitely gives an impetus to the point that Kashmir still is an agenda within the international community, within the international power centers, and it is subject to the final settlement, taking into consideration the predominant view of the people of Kashmir.
Mr. Khan, what are your thoughts on this? Because as Mr. Siddiqui there correctly pointed out, this brings the issue back into the international spotlight, and one would hope then that this would mean that the international community, the European Union, will then try to then have this proper discussion then be carried out in this regard, with the Kashmiris, of course, at the center of it.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a welcome step, but I'm not quite sure if it's going to make any difference to what's going on the ground in Kashmir. This is one of those voices that the Kashmiri people luckily have in the European Parliament, as well as other parliaments, UK Parliament. There are constant debates in UK Parliament on Kashmir. But unfortunately, it's exactly 2 years today when the Indian government revoked the Article 370. Nothing has changed in Kashmir. There hasn't been any world pressure on India. Unfortunately, we have to ask as Kashmiris, what's happening in European Parliament, even United States. It's all work of our diaspora communities all over the world, communities, and it's providing some solace for them. There is a certain amount of support, but unfortunately, India isn't budging. India isn't going to change its course in dividing up Kashmir into. They've already taken the steps to divide Kashmir, the state of J&K under Indian control, into two separate union territories. There is a huge outcry, but nobody in the world is listening about the demographic changes that the Indian government is implementing right now. Millions of people are apparently on their list to give them the domicile certificates, which we have no idea how many they've issued, how many more they're likely to issue, and that exactly is what the intention was for revocation of Article 370 and 35A, and they're unfortunately on it, and they've been working on it quite well. The only thing that India has failed on, which is some comfort to Kashmiri resistance movement, is that they were hoping for, they were planning for huge international and national investment into Jammu and Kashmir, so that the people of Kashmir will have a diversion. But that hasn't worked out for them. There has been none whatsoever investment into Kashmir so far, as the BJP government planned.
Okay, so if I may come, Mr. Khan, you made some very, very pertinent points there, and I will, of course, come back to you. Mr. Siddiqui, on the point that Mr. Khan there made right at the end, and of course I take all of his points with a lot of respect that he made earlier as well about how we've gotten to this point of highlighting this issue of Kashmir internationally, I'm saying. But on the issue then of how this has worked out for India as well, what its goals may have been by revoking Article 370 and what it hoped to achieve in the aftermath of that. Is it fair to say, as Mr. Khan there, and I'm paraphrasing his words, of course, that the Indian policy really has failed? Is that fair to say?
You see, it's very important to understand one, the narrative of Kashmiri. The second, what India is doing in occupied Kashmir. And what has happened that in 1947, when they annexed Kashmir, and there was an instrument of accession between the Maharaja and the then Maharaja and the Indian government, that we would be having this Kashmir annexed or accession to Kashmir on the basis of some points which were written down, and one of them was that you will keep the sanctity of Kashmiri nationalism and Kashmiri culture, and Kashmiri land and territory will not be subject to the invasion or settlement from India. So that was the condition between Maharaja and in the later stages, it was because at that stage there was no constitution of newly formed India. India had no constitution. It was still going on with the British Penal Code. And it was in 1950 when India came up with the constitution. And in that constitution, because Kashmir was still an agenda in the United Nations, subject to the resolution and settlement between India and Pakistan. So for the lawmakers of Indians, it was a dilemma how to incorporate the agreement that they had made with the then Maharaja into the constitution and keep the status of Kashmir still within the realms of international law.
Yeah.
So what they did is that they incorporated Article 370 in the Constitution of India. So it is basically an article which has been made by the Indian lawmakers, and over the years it was erased and eroded. And as Professor Azmat said, there was in 2019, 5th August, they just removed this article. Right. It is their prerogative. It's a democracy. Okay, then they did it. But what it exactly did to Kashmir is that it removed the legal connection between India and Kashmir. So eventually, and it becomes that India has only boots and its army, and on the basis of that army, it is holding Kashmir. There is no legal sanctity. It had the legal sanctity, which it was producing rather into the United Nations, saying that this is Kashmiris have acceded, and I have an instrument of accession, and the instrument of accession has these conditions.
Right. Yeah.
And so when he removed it, what remains there? A pure naked occupation. And
indeed.
Now,
and on that point, Mr. Siddiqui, because Mr. Khan, I wanted to bring you in on this, and I wanted to, and you correctly pointed out, of course, the internationalization of this issue, as you'd put it, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, your words, Mr. Khan. But even in this letter, and I'm sure you have read it in detail, the MEPs say that the continuing issue of Kashmir as it currently stands and the occupation, and it's not being resolved in this essential stalemate that we are at right now, vis-a-vis Article 370 being revoked, these many security laws in place, the huge militarization of that region, that this is very dangerous for the region as well. And this is something that Prime Minister Imran Khan has also said a number of times, that this issue needs to be resolved for the sake of peace in the region and stability of the region. So this is beyond that as well. Is it important to continue to make that case to the world as well? Because this is beyond, and this could be extra regional as well, an issue?
Yes, correct. But I think there is a little bit of a danger in concentrating on the human rights issue and not the key word in that letter, the right of self-determination for the Kashmiri people on both sides is missing. And that's where, unfortunately, my point was that we are failing in terms of internationalizing the key issue, which is demilitarization of the whole region. That's where the conflict is. It's all about the two military, in fact, three now, with the three nuclear powers facing off each other in Kashmir. That's where the world concern is in terms of potential danger for the world communities. But the key issue that we, the Kashmiri people, are concerned with is the right of self-determination, the exercise to be able to vote for their right for independence. That is missing, and that hasn't been taken up internationally properly. Despite the diaspora communities all over the world, very active on this issue. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't got that far is because we have a serious diplomatic deficit.
Right. So, Mr. Siddiqui, let me bring you in on that issue of self-determination, because yes, that is an extremely important one, isn't it? What are your thoughts about the importance of centering that issue at all times? Because there's no argument there that it needs to be down to Kashmiris to decide what happens.
Yes. A right to self-determination, which is the basic unalienable right of any nation state. It has to be adhered, and the sanctity of this word should be met with total functioning. The right to self-determination of a nation, which was a word which was invented basically by Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the United States. And it was in the Balkan states when they started that, okay, now these Balkan states have come out within after the First World War. So let us give them the right to choose for their future. And that is something which has carried all the way from that time to the modern civilized moral political systems. So this is a very important issue, and coming back to what Professor Azmat is saying, that world is not going to listen to you if you project and if you advocate Kashmir as a bilateral issue. Kashmir is an issue of the political rights as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, as enshrined in the United Nations Governance of Political and Civil Rights. So that is where Kashmir issue should be projected by Kashmiris. And India would like to, and it would love to have Kashmir projected and shown as a territorial issue between India and Pakistan, because world out there is not interested in taking some portion of land from one country and giving it to another country. That is not going to happen. So what is going to happen, and exactly what is going to happen.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Siddiqui. Unfortunately, the clock is getting the best of us. I do sincerely apologize for cutting you off, sir. Mr. Khan, I just wanted to give you about a minute and a half, if you could, as a concluding comment. What do you think happen next? And I'm going back to our original discussion about the EU itself. What do you think the response will be here? I mean, so far, there hasn't been a huge response, I believe, at least from the EU Commission. Certainly, there's been a lot of talk online in response to the Vice President of the European Parliament tweeting about this.
Yes, well, I suspect the Indian government will not respond. They have not responded to the international community concerns in terms of human rights, although they claim that they have covered a lot of territory in terms of rights abuses. The Indian point of view, the Indian government stance, remember, in terms of international projection in the way that they want to carry on with the Kashmir issue is their false claim, that the territory under the Pakistani control is illegally occupied by by Pakistan. And the Pakistani claim, the counter-claim that Indian territory, the areas under Indian control are illegally occupied by India. And that argument has been going on for 75 years, 30 years of this Kashmiri struggle resistance movement has been carrying on for the Kashmiris to be recognized as the prime party to this issue and not project this issue as a territorial dispute. The problems that we're going to be faced with in the next 10, 20, 30 years if we keep calling this a bilateral issue. But then we have the similar agreement between India and Pakistan. It hasn't been dropped. Pakistani government is not prepared to shunt it. They're not going to tear it up.
Both yourself and Mr. Siddiqui for taking your time out today for speaking to us respectively from London and Toronto. We really appreciate the context to the discussion that both of you gentlemen have brought. We were discussing there, at least we started off with discussing the EU letter. A number of MPs, 15 MPs have written to the European Commission, including the Vice President of the European Parliament, speaking about not only human rights issues in Kashmir, as our guests are correctly pointed out, but also talking about the issue as a flashpoint issue overall, which has regional implications, has security implications, and certainly can be extra-regional an issue as well. As I've mentioned to one of our guests, this is something that Prime Minister Imran Khan has also warned of, that this is also a security issue. This is also an issue for peace in the region overall and regional stability, and that needs to be understood as well by all parties involved. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.